Let's talk saw guides. We're going to assemble the SCC saw guide right now. Let's get started. Our saw guide system comes with 2 rails and a universal base plate. Our base plate works with most worm drive saws to keep your equipment right on track. Our 2 saw guide rails will marry together to create an 8-foot length to keep your sheet goods nice and straight. You could also use one length to be able to cut a 4x8 sheet good as a cross-cut system. Both are great, and each is going to keep your cuts extremely true. Also, you're going to save time, you're going to save space, and you're going to save on your budget. A panel saw may not be in the budget, but this is going to give you excellent results. You can utilize your existing worm drive saw or get a new saw, whatever you prefer, but the saw doesn't have to be used with the saw guide to be useful. It works in and out of the jig. Step 1 is simple. We're going to make 2 cuts out of a sheet of plywood that has 2 factory edges that are nice and straight. The first one's going to be 12 inches, the other cut's going to be 3 inches. Let's get started. I told you it was simple. We built in a buffer. This cut doesn't need to be perfect. We're going to freehand cut both of these with our worm drive. Let's do it right now. It'd be nice to have a finished saw guide right about now to make a perfect cut, wouldn't it? Let's do it. I have a Makita and a skill saw worm drive. Both of these setups work perfectly for those saws, and these dimensions have worked perfectly for either saw as well. So just be sure that you're not too much bigger than what I'm doing before you cut your plywood, and just confirm with your measurements. But when we get all finished, this will all make sense. I guarantee it. Pro tip, use foam as your base on your saw table, and it's an excellent surface to cut on. You don't need sawhorses. Okay, we have an oversized piece for the middle of our saw guide. As you can see, this would be too big to go into my saw guide as we've cut it. That's okay. I'm going to use my table saw to get it exactly where we need to be. We need to be about 1 15/16 wide by about 5/8 thick. Our saw will do both of those cuts. You don't need a planer. Let's go get it cut right now. Remember, we marked the factory side. This is the side we want to run against the fence. We know it's straight, so we're going to use the factory straightness to create a straight edge. 1 15/16. Okay, what I'm going to do is take about a blade off of this. I want a 5/8 inch piece of wood. That's about right to house my saw guide. You know what's nice about building your base out of wood? It's sacrificial. I could use this for a year. If it gets beat up in my panel van or my work truck, I could simply do this again. I won't bend up an aluminum base rail, and my saw guide is ready to work. Next step, we're going to find our center point in our guide rail as well as the guide base. All right, mark the center of your saw guide rail. Just to be easy, mark it at 1 inch. You may be a 1/16 off, but we're going to sacrifice a little on each side. This plywood has a pretty glossy surface, so I sanded to create adhesion between the Titebond wood glue and my other piece of wood. I want to glue it, nail it, and screw it. This is a long-term bond, and we want it to stay true. What I'm going to do before I screw it is apply a bead of Titebond 2 wood glue. I'm going to pin nail it down. I'll start at my 2 ends because I have my center points marked. After that, I'm going to use a tape measure from my factory edge to my straight edge. What this is going to do is ensure that everything stays nice and parallel and true because I have factory and factory facing each other. It's going to be a nice straight edge to start out with. Let's get started. You can see why it's nice to have that factory edge work to your benefit. As long as you get this ledger nice and straight, the rest of your cuts are gonna be straight. Let's attach our saw guide and run our sacrificial cuts. And now our saw guide is set and ready to go. Let's go. Next thing we're gonna do is mark our factory points. We don't wanna screw down our ledger where we're also gonna screw down our saw guide. So I'll mark that with a Sharpie, I'll remove it, I'll put in my wood screws that attach my guide to my base, and then we'll finally finish with our guide rails. Here we go. I'm going to pre-drill so I don't cause a lot of tension screwing down those wood screws and I don't get anything out of alignment. When I screw this down, I'm going to go in between my other pilot holes. That's so that I don't cause interference with the other screws, plus it's going to be a lot stronger. Let's run our coarse thread Phillips screws so that this wood stays nice and tight. We're going to use pan head screws as our fasteners to attach our saw guide to our saw rail. This distributes that force and creates a perfect attachment. Simply split the difference between the front and the back of your jig. Your jig's not going to protrude over that 8-foot section, so just align it in the center. When attaching your saw guide and saw rail, use a drill that you can dial back the clutch so you don't over tighten your screws. Prior planning prevents poor performance. When you go purchase your plywood, simply take it to their panel saw at the hardware store, ask the cutter to cut you a 12-inch piece and a 3-inch piece, and that saves you 2 steps. How's that for thinking ahead? Next step, let's attach our universal base plate to our saw while it's set up in the saw guide. This keeps your alignment true and makes it easy to attach. There's 2 points of reference to keep in mind when attaching your base plate to your saw. You want to keep the edge that the saw is actually going to run against and the front in mind. That's what's going to jam to the actual saw guide and to the front of the base plate. We're going to find a few places to attach my base plate to my saw, and then we'll be ready to rock and roll. Here we go. Pro tip, we're only going to do 1 fastener at a time. Get it all set up, get it locked in, get your saw set back in, and then you're going to get a really quality install. We're going to use a 3/16 drill bit and a countersink on the underside of our saw base. That way we have a perfectly flush ride as we go across our substrates. Okay, we got our first screw located. Now what we're going to do is get our second. 2 is better than 1, and 3 is better than 2. Let's do it. Now that I have 2 points of reference, I don't need it in my saw guide. I'm actually going to get over here to the other side and put another fastener. Here we go. I can't get my drill down this way, so on this final bolt, I'm actually going to come through the other side. Work smarter, not harder. This base has never been plunged through, so as we plunge through this base, we're also going to plunge through our saw guide. So I'm going to clamp it to my table so I have a nice rigid system, and I'm going to do my first cut, and I'm going to actually cut off my excess on this side, and then I'll repeat that process on the other side, and then I have a dual side saw guide that's definitely usable on both sides. When you initially plunge cut through your system, you're going to want to set your saw into the jig a little bit. You don't want it overhanging because you're not as rigid. Shove it in, you're nice and square at a 90, and you're going to plunge cut. Let's get started. Let's finish the cut. What does the saw guide help us do? Well, a number of things. It's going to give us straight cuts on any substrates that we want. This cut that I did freehand, we're going to clean that up right now and put a factory edge of our own on this piece of plywood. It also allows us to use it as a long straight edge. You can also make a 4-foot one for cross cuts. The sky's the limit. We get asked about our saw guide all the time. How'd you make it? What do I do? How do I get one? We actually offer these on our website. At stonecoatcountertops.com, we have a tools section with tools designed for the do-it-yourselfer to get things done. Let's clean up this cut and make it factory. By adjusting the length of your fasteners, you can create this out of 5/8, even 1/2-inch plywood if you wish, to reduce the weight or even get a deeper plunge. I prefer 3/4 simply because it's durable, it's hefty, and it's what I always have in stock. Another added benefit is the reduction of tear out. Because of the saw guide being sandwiched over your nice plywood, it reduces that tear out because it's simply clamping, sandwiching, and creating a nice clean cut. That's my portable panel saw right there. Our tool section is designed for the cabinet maker, the woodworker, the countertop contractor, the do-it-yourselfer, the designer, and anybody who wants to learn to get things done on a budget, effective, and under precision.